rowboat in the pond, and the Duke offered a peach to his lover, who took the peach and ate the other half. And so that's the origin of the expression half-eaten peach. Has anyone heard the expression half-eaten peach? And so that's the other euphemism that was used in China for many centuries for homosexual or gay or homoerotic love. Okay. This is a naughty one. I thought I'd include a few, X-rated images. And it is interesting how, if you do enough research, you find a lot of these sort of naughty pictures. Most of them are straight heterosexual sex, but here you actually see quite clearly, two males, and one of them appears to be, presenting in a very feminine gender presentation, but he's clearly male. And so this is another illustration of male love. There aren't too many of these, but if you do a lot of research, you can find them. And of course, once again, they substantiate the fact that homosexuality was recognized in some form in China before the coming of the British and Europeans, So, in Beijing opera, the Don was the male actor who played the roles of women, because Beijing opera was all male, like it was beefing theater. It was considered quite scandalous for women to be on the stage. So they had young men, usually teenagers or very young adults, play all the women's roles. And so that's the Beijing opera Don. And the 1993 film that I mentioned by Chen Kaiga, starring Leslie Cheung, was, I think it's a rather extraordinary film, really. It's really worth seeing. I'm sure you can get it online. There is, unfortunately, not much about lesbianism. First of all, women were considered of no significance in patriarchal China. So there's not much about women except for a few prominent women who might have been empresses or something like that. By the way, there was one empress who the Empress Wu during the Tang Dynasty, they called a male emperor because she actually was a sovereign empress and actually ruled in her own name. She was the only woman to rule China in her own name. Now there have been women like, famous or notorious Empress Dowager in the 19th century who ruled in effect, but who didn't actually have that title. So the Empress Wu was one example. So there's a strong bias towards the male, and there's very little research on lesbianism or female bisexuality. Almost none, really. But there's some very interesting little tidbits that I found out about doing this research. The Golden Orchid Association, I think that's very interesting. Orchids, I think Maplethorpe was onto something with orchids. Jinglan Hui was a Chinese women's organization that celebrated passionate friendships and embraced same-sex intimacy. And these, the origins of these groups may go as far back as the Zhou dynasty in the 18th century. Some of them participated in what we would call commitment ceremonies, where two women actually had kind of same-sex marriages that were recognized by that community, not necessarily by the larger society, but certainly by that community. And so they'd have wedding banquets and exchange of ritual gifts. A lot of this I found years ago. A friend of mine gave me this as a gift, Castles of Encyclopedia of Queer and Symbol and Spirit, which is really a very valuable source of information about all of this. It's not just A&PI specific. It talks about LGBT queer spirituality and religious practices in all different cultures. And the women of the Golden Orchid Association engaged in practices that they euphemistically refer to as grinding tofu. Which I thought was an amazing metaphor. It makes you think about, tofu and home and light. But there was a woman who attended the presentation at Creating Change who actually had a comment on it. Do you remember, Dennis, what she said about that?
I think she said something about like tofu being used as a sex toy, like forming it into like very firm tofu, forming into like dildos.
That would have to be pretty firm tofu. I guess that would be called extra firm. So anyway, that's the euphemism that they used. Okay. And another group was called the Rubbing Mirror Society. There's a lot of rubbing and grinding going on. This was founded in Guangdong province near Canton in the 17th century by a Buddhist nun. And once again, there seems to be evidence that women in these societies participated in same-sex unions of some sort. You know, that they even had wedding banquets or exchanges of gifts, and that their relationships in these groups were actually recognized as being like marriages. Probably not recognized by the state, by the government, but certainly by these groups. And so it eventually became known as the 10 Sisters, and it was called the Mojing Dang in Chinese. So by the mid-19th century, there's this philosophy of Jiatang, and it emerges out of syncretic. Do you all know what syncretic means? Basically, pulling together in an amalgam, but not necessarily fully synthesizing the elements. So diverse elements of Taoist and Buddhist traditions, expressing itself through communal living. It sounds like hippie commune or something like that, or a co-op of a food co-op. In vegetarian halls or spinster houses. I don't know what the connection between being a spinster and being a vegetarian is, but it's interesting. Emphasizing gender equality, and we'll talk about Guan Yin, the Buddhist bodhisattva of compassion. How many of you have heard of Guan Yin? Probably just about everyone. Yeah. And we'll talk about Guan Yin. Here are two images. She's often referred to as the bodhisattva of compassion. This is from a Chinese temple in Thailand. She's very golden. Now, Guan Yin is one of the most interesting characters. She's also a Taoist deity, Taoists in China revere her as well as Buddhists. There are many different stories about Guan Yin. One story has her basically as a transgender deity, as we would say, transitioning from male to female, starting out as male and then ending up as female. So that particular version of the story I think is really interesting, and there's some Asians, particularly transgendered Asians in Asia, who revere Guan Yin particularly for that. In general, she's revered as bodhisattva of compassion, who is the spirit of compassion and love, and she's usually depicted as being quite feminine. There are some depictions of Guan Yin as male. So the goddess of mercy, she who hears the cries of the world, said to be a manifestation of Avalokitesvara, I said that right. I think that's a Sanskrit term, male Buddha of Pure Land, who transforms into a female, according to Vern Bullock. There's a particular sect in Tibet of Buddhists, the Gelug or Gelugpa, the Yellowhead sect, which has been associated with same-sex relations among monks in its institutions, especially this particular monastery at Sela. And actually, I read an article in the Journal of Asian Studies recently about homosexuality in Buddhist monasteries in Japan, which is very interesting as well. Japan. Male homosexuality, there's a very long tradition in Buddhist monasteries, and Gary Luke wrote this book called Male Colors, The Construction of Homosexuality in Tokugawa, Japan. The Tokugawa were the last shogunate. The shogunate was abolished in 1868 at the time of the Meiji Restoration. The Tokugawa ruled Japan from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s. There are several different terms that the Japanese have used to describe or refer to homosexuality. The most popular seems to be nanshoku, meaning male eros. There's also wakashuru, the way of use, nando, the way of men, ido, the beautiful way, and hido, the secret way. Have any of you heard these terms before? It's all news to Nobu. You've never.
Only know the first one. The other, I don't know.
Have you heard these terms before? Have you heard these terms?
I don't know about non-rural people. Never heard of such a thing.
You've never heard of these?
I can imagine the characters that non-do is the real man, such that that's not.
Well, do means way, of course, like Bushido, the way of the warrior. Okay, there's a great book that I'm reading now called The Great Mirror of Male Love, Nanshoku Okagami. And this is the most famous collection of homoerotic stories published in Japan, which dates from about 1687, in the late 17th century. And each of these stories has a different sort of take on male homosexuality, nanshoku, in all its various varieties. Here are some images from Japan. Now, as you know, the onagata, like the Beijing opera don, was a male who played the women's role, since women were not allowed in the theater in Japan, just like in China in pre-modern times. The onagata, here's a little hand scroll from 1750 showing a kabuki actor, two kabuki actors, including the younger onagata, who is younger and more feminine than the older man. This is Tamaso Buro, who's a famous kabuki onagata. Now, the interesting thing here is, you might think that all the onagata were either gay or transgendered or queer, as we would say. In fact, a lot of the onagata are straight married men who do not dress as women except in the theater. So it's important in this case not to assume that they're necessarily gay and or transgender. Some of them are, but a lot of them are not. And one of the most famous living onagata is a straight married man with children and grandchildren, and has no interest in a feminine gender identity, but he's said to be one of the best onagata on the stage. Korea, land of my birth. So here's a lot of interesting history. In Korea, there are at least 4 distinct traditions that we would call homoerotic or proto-transgender. The oldest is the Hwarang, who were a warrior elite of archers. So you think butch, right? But, but in fact, they wore makeup and long flowing gowns and paraded around, like women. And so there's an interesting paradox there. The Hwarang tradition has been documented, but very few people know about it. They emerged in the Shilla dynasty, which has great prestige in Korea, because that's the dynasty that unified the Korean peninsula for the first time. The Namsadan were troops of village actors who would go from village to village and just get paid little coins and trinkets when they would perform. In the Namsadan, the young men played women's roles. There were, for the most part, no female Namsadan. Just like in Beijing opera or the kabuki theater or the Elizabethan theater of Shakespeare. And the young men who played the women's roles were often rumored or said to be the lovers of the older men who played men's roles.